Thank you all for coming. My name is John Donahue, and one of the most rewarding aspects of teaching at Stanford Law School is that some of the greatest graduates of the law school return as distinguished visiting lecturers, where they enrich not only our students, but also our faculty. Tonight, the opportunity is being extended to all of you. David Hayes, who has spent this academic year at Stanford, also as a senior fellow at the Hewlett Foundation, has been a major player in the area of environmental and natural resources law in the government during both the Clinton and Obama administrations. During the Clinton administration, David served as counselor to Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt, and then as the Deputy Secretary of the Interior. Before and between his service in the Clinton and Obama administrations, David practiced environment and energy law as global chairman of the Environment, Land, and Resources Department of the firm Latham & Watkins. He was also served as a senior fellow of the World Wildlife Fund and as a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute. When Barack Obama was first elected president, David headed up the Energy and Environment Review for the Presidential Transition Team, with responsibility over the Departments of Agriculture, Interior, Energy, and the EPA. From 2009 until last summer, David served as the Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the Department of the Interior in the Obama administration. His nomination was confirmed without a single dissenting vote in the Senate on May 20th, 2009, which may have been the last time that the Senate Republicans unanimously agreed with anything done by President Obama. During his tenure as Deputy Secretary, where he was widely and enthusiastically praised by members of both parties for his knowledge and attention to detail, his fairness, tenacity, and wisdom in addressing vexing environmental and natural resource issues, David helped to develop the administration's response to the African wildlife trafficking crisis and was then appointed by the president to the White House Advisory Council on Wildlife Trafficking. David played a principal role in developing the administration's anti-trafficking initiative and the executive order that the president signed in Tanzania in July. As President Obama has noted, the entire world has a stake in protecting the world's iconic animals, and the United States is strongly committed to meeting its obligations. But while a pound of gold sells for a little over $18,000, a rhino horn sells for more than $45,000 a pound. So the rewards to poachers in Africa can be enormous, and the threat to elephants and rhinos is intense. Not surprisingly, organized criminal enterprises have been attracted to the trade, and it is estimated that poachers illegally killed 35,000 elephants in 2012, which represents a non-trivial fraction of the declining population of African elephants. Indeed, just back from Africa myself, I can attest to the violence of the trade. I have 3 machete wounds in my leg, which is why I'm on crutches today. Just kidding, it's a basketball injury. Moreover, the U.S. is one of the largest markets for illicit animal parts, since much of the ivory, rhino horn, and other animal parts are processed in the country before being shipped to Asia. Poachers will saw off rhino horns from live rhinos and just leave them to bleed to death. The sudden rise in price has even led to thefts from museums around the world of rhino and elephant trophies, at times fueled by inaccurate and unscientific claims in Asia about supposed medicinal value of these parts. This international trade is financing terrorists, destabilizing governments, and threatening the existence of some of the world's most iconic wildlife species. While the overall picture seems wholly dire, the best piece of news is that we have someone with David's enormous talents to help tackle this challenging issue. Please join me in welcoming David Hayes. Thank you very much.
John, I'll be sure and ask you to come on the next safari. So thank you for that nice introduction. Thank you for all you do, and for Maureen, who welcomed me here to Stanford with open arms as we talked about elephants and the crisis in Africa and the important topic for tonight. So I've been trying to think of a light way to start this conversation, and it's hard, actually. I've been coming up a little bit empty, but I'll start with a short vignette. When I left the Department of the Interior last July, there's a tradition of the bureau heads giving a departing deputy secretary a gift, and it's a chance to collect some pretty good swag sometimes. Now, not from the Bureau of Reclamation, where you might get a picture of a dam, or the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which fashions themselves to like the pictures of offshore oil rigs, which I had to take down when I moved in January of 2009. But the department does have the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management, some of the best lands ever, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is usually good for a fly rod or a carved wood duck or something like that. Well, when it came time for Dan Ash, Director of Fish and Wildlife Service, to give me something, here's what he gave me. Loaned it, actually, because of my work, our work together on the international wildlife crisis. And this is a disturbing piece, actually. I'm going to be very glad. He gave it to me with the promise that I show it at Stanford for educational purposes. So I'm completing that obligation right now, and it's going to go right back to Washington. But it was probably the most memorable and important gift that anyone gave me, because this work is so important, and I very much appreciate all of you coming tonight to talk further about it. So let me dive right in if I can. And I'm going to start with some statistics, and it's a little grim. First, in terms of African elephants, nearly 100 elephants a day are being killed by poachers in Africa as we speak. In fact, the Wildlife Conservation Society, as you may know, has a campaign called 96 Elephants, because that's the more exact number of how many elephants are killed every day. Now, in 1980, there were 1.2 million elephants, approximately, in the sub-Saharan African continent. The best guess is now that there are about 400,000. And it's a guess. On the left, in the yellow, you get the most solid figures. It could be as high as 600,000, but most folks think probably around 400, 420,000. It's estimated, as John just mentioned, that 30 to 35,000 were killed last year alone. And the trend line is particularly disturbing. It's dramatic in its recency. You can see here the percentage of elephants that are being killed every year. And obviously the percentage goes up as the baseline goes down. But even with that, you have an enormous jump from 2009 to 2011, with the middle point there being the point of no return in terms of decline of the species. And just to give you a couple of other data points on how recent and serious and dramatic this rise in poaching is, in Kenya, in 2007, fewer than 50 elephants were poached. That went up to 250 by 2009. And by 2012, the last year we have good data, 400 elephants in the space of, what is that, 5 years. So where are the elephants? Where are the large populations that are left in Africa? As you can see, there are large concentrations in East Africa, with Tanzania and Kenya in particular, in Southern Africa, and in Central Africa, with then scattered populations. The blue reflects some uncertainty in terms of the numbers. What is interesting and disturbing is that the poachers are hitting certain populations and really devastating them, with very high rates of poaching, in particular in Central and East Africa. And one example is the Selous area in southern Tanzania and the adjacent area, the Niassa area in Mozambique. Both very important parks, protected areas in theory. And the Selous area in 1976 had an estimated 109,000 elephants. By 2009, that had dropped to 39,000 elephants. In late 2013, there was a very good survey done that showed only 13,000 are left. Again, 1976, 109,000. Today, around 13,000. A 66% decline in the last 4 years alone. And CITES, which is the international body that regulates the trade in endangered species, has shown that 9 out of the 10 major East African protected areas showed record levels of killing in 2011. In terms of overall areas that are being most impacted, this chart gives you a sense. The black part of the circle are the illegally killed elephants. The white are the reflect naturally dying elephants. And you can see that South Africa has not yet been hit hard by poaching of elephants, in part because rhino has been a more economically beneficial a commodity for the poachers there. But you can see in East Africa, Central Africa, just how hard hit the populations are. And obviously, that's unsustainable. Now, you look at the statistics, and that's part of it. But what we're talking about, that's the head part of the story. There's a heart part of the story, too. Elephants are incredibly intelligent. They have a well-developed social structure. They are magnificent. They're the largest mammals that roam the earth. And the tale of these killings, when you get behind the statistics, is truly heart-rendering. I'm not going to show pictures of dead elephants, but I'll just mention a couple of incidents to give you a feel for how serious this poaching issue is and how cruel it is. So Matthew Scully wrote a terrific piece in The Atlantic last June, and he described in a single night in mid-March of last year in Chad, Central Africa, 89 elephants were slaughtered in one night. The reports are that 50 folks armed with AK-47s did the killing, and it's assumed to be the same group that had come over from Sudan the year before and had executed 450 elephants in Cameroon using rocket-propelled grenades. The New York Times, September of 2012, Jeffrey Gettleman talked about carnage that occurred in Garamba National Park in the Congo in this, actually September 2013. That spring, 22 elephants were found dead in a cluster. They all had a single bullet hole through the head of their skull. A Ugandan military helicopter was seen nearby, and later highly suspected this was a rogue military operation. In Garamba National Park, there were, 10 years ago, 20,000 elephants. Today, there are fewer than 2,000 elephants. And some of you may have read last week, or earlier this week, I guess it was last week, famous mountain bull elephant was killed near the Lua Wildlife Conservancy within the boundaries of Mount Kenya National Park. This was a famous elephant that had led a migration of 2,000 elephants through a difficult passage and had been featured by CBS Evening News a few months before he was killed just a few weeks ago. And at the same time, there's a human toll here, too, which is huge. Within the last few weeks, the head of law enforcement at the Zambian reserve, Lua Plain National Park, was killed when he came upon two poachers and was shot. Not a happy story, to say the least. Let's talk about rhinos. Rhinos were once very abundant through Africa and Asia. There are very few left in Asia, fewer than, a handful of thousands in very highly scattered, fragmented landscapes. There is a stronghold of rhinos, white rhinos, over 20,000 in South Africa. almost exclusively in South Africa, about 5,000 black rhinos, some in South Africa, some further north. But 90% of the white rhinos in Africa are in South Africa. Most of them are in Kruger National Park. And the poaching that is occurring with the rhino, and look at this acceleration in the last few years, is truly stunning. Now, we're talking about basically a stock of 20,000 white rhinos. So last year alone, over 1,000 were poached. And as John said, the price of a rhino horn can be $60,000 for no purpose. It's the same material as in your fingernails. It's keratin, but it's viewed as having a medicinal quality in traditional Chinese medicine. And the rate is continuing. This year, 2 a year. And I was in South Africa at Kruger National Park a few months ago, and the head of the park described it as a war. I met commandos that are under the authority of the military. The park has its own commandos as well. The border with Mozambique is porous, and despite South Africa, with probably the strongest government organizationally and with a serious effort underway, on a full moon night, they expect at least 30 separate incursion parties coming in from Mozambique, tracking and looking to kill rhinos to bring them back to Mozambique. And within 24 hours, they're in Vietnam, the horn is. So there's hope. And before I get to the hope part, I have to talk about a not so hopeful, a bit of unfortunate history, very unfortunate history, but it's history that we were able to overcome. There was a tremendous slaughter of elephants, in particular, in the 70s and 80s in Africa before. This is something that folks aren't that familiar with, but let me give you a couple more statistics that are relevant here. So I mentioned that in the late 1970s, there were an estimated 1.2 million elephants in Africa. By 1989, that number had dropped to about 600,000 elephants. So Africa lost 600,000 elephants in 10 years. That's about, well, you know, a huge 60, 70,000, obviously, a year. And it was interesting what was causing it. It was not what we're having today, and I'll talk about the contrast, but it was a time in Africa when there were local militias, local wars, civil wars, Idi Amin, the conflicts in the Sudan, Somalia, and essentially the poaching was implemented by the local militias, local armies, in order to feed the wars that were occurring in Africa. So how did it stop? And is there a lesson here for us as we face now another challenge in terms of a current slaughter of elephants? Well, the key, three keys: African leadership, U.S. leadership, and the CITES ban on commercial ivory trade. So in terms of Africa leadership, some of you will remember past Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi's famous burning of the stock of seized tusks in Kenya in the late 1980s. That was combined with a very effective paramilitary operation in Kenya, in Tanzania, where Operation Uhai led to the arrest of 2,500 people in 6 months. There were shoot-to-kill orders in Kenya. In Zimbabwe, there was Operation Stronghold, which also went in and essentially stopped the poachers in their tracks. You also had U.S. leadership back then. The chair of the President's Advisory Council on Wildlife Trafficking, for which I'm the vice chair, Judith McHale, was in 1989 the president of the Discovery Channel. The very first documentary the Discovery Channel did was on the African crisis at the time, called Ivory Wars. And it, along with the work of many NGOs and others, brought attention, huge attention in the United States to this issue. In fact, it's today why Hillary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton are so passionate about elephants, because they talked about it around the table in the 80s as this was occurring. They discussed it at their dinner table down in Little Rock. The African Wildlife Foundation had a very successful Only Elephants Should Wear Ivory campaign. And a lot of the kinds of things we're trying to do today happened in the 1980s and led to success. So you had African leadership, U.S. leadership, and then ultimately leadership from the international community through CITES. CITES is the convention that governs the trade in endangered species. 180 countries are members. In 1989, they uplisted the 2 species of African elephants that were being hardest hit to Appendix 1, which meant that it was now illegal for any African signatory of CITES to export unworked ivory or any country to accept it as an import. And what happened was amazing. Right after that ban, the trade stopped cold. There had been a lot of awareness of it. It was not cool to trade ivory, and some of the populations began to come back. So what went wrong? Why didn't that stick? Well, we've got some new factors in play now. Now, mind you, that effort that culminated in 1989 stayed pretty strong for another 10 years. And again, remember, this is a sharp shift that we're seeing now in terms of timing and the worst of the slaughter, just the last 5 years, even the last 4 years. So what is new, and why are we even more worried about this now? Well, first, we're dealing with smaller populations. Before the 70s and 80s crisis, you were starting from 1.2 million elephants in Africa. We now have maybe 400,000 elephants in Africa, 20,000 rhinos. There's much less room for error. Probably the most significant factor in play is the big new market that's emerged. Largely, the demand for ivory is traced back to the exploding middle class in China. Now we have new wealth, able to buy a traditional Chinese valued jewelry, basically, and it is the primary driver for ivory. And it seems as though the market is insatiable. We have an unfortunate combination of a tremendous demand, new customers all the time, a declining source of ivory. Actually, there should be no ivory available, but obviously a highly motivated group of poachers who can't keep up with the demand and will only be able to keep up with the demand, arguably, by extirpating the elephants. Price of ivory is $1,300 a pound. So I don't know what this is, maybe 15 pounds. It's pretty good money. This is why I locked my door of the office over at Newcomb. The other factor that is at play is that these poachers are different now. I described the militia type, army, feed the army type in the 70s and 80s. Now we're dealing with sophisticated, organized criminal syndicates. And they are moving ivory very quickly through transit points to Asian markets. And who are these folks? Well, Hillary Clinton, as I'll mention, when she was secretary, as I'll mention a little bit more in a minute, when she was Secretary of State in the fall of 2012, had a major speech on this issue and really kicked off the U.S. attention to the issue. And she asked for the U.S. intelligence agencies to do an analysis of who's behind the poaching crisis. And the unclassified report, I think, is very instructive. And I'm going to read just a few sentences of it for you. Criminal elements of all kinds, including some terrorist entities and rogue security personnel, often in collusion with government officials in source countries, are involved in poaching and movement of ivory and rhino horn across East, Central, and Southern Africa. We assess with high confidence that traffickers use sophisticated networks and the complicity of public officials in order to move ivory and rhino horn from relatively remote areas to markets and ports of export, perpetuating corruption and border insecurity in key Eastern, Central, and Southern African states. We judge some of these networks probably are the same or overlap with those of other illicit goods such as drugs and weapons. Continue. 2 more sentences. Poaching represents significant security challenges for militaries and police forces in African nations, e.g. Kenya, Tanzania, Congo, South Africa, and others, which are often outgunned by poachers and their criminal and extremist allies. Corruption and lack of sufficient penal and financial deterrence are hampering these governments' abilities to reduce poaching and trafficking. So, new players, sophisticated players in it for the long haul. Next, we understand now more than ever, I think, the economic and environmental importance of wildlife. Economic importance to the economies of many of these African nations. Tanzania, for example, their tourist economy is largely wildlife-based, as some of you may know who have had the good fortune to go to Tanzania and see their magnificent wildlife. That tourist economy was sized at $60 million in 1990. Today, it's estimated to be worth $1.25 billion. Also, as far as the economics go, the corrupting influence of the money and the gangs and the syndicates are dampening other economic opportunities. When I was in Dar es Salaam a few months ago, meeting with some folks who are on the front lines of anti-poachers, I was joined by a representative of a large mining company. Why are you involved in this? Why do you care about this? Well, it's because we can't depend on safe commerce. Our workers are worried. I mean, it is infecting the entire economy. We also understand the importance of, more and more so, of elephants and rhinos to the environment. The natural environment. Elephants are, what have they been called here? Ecosystem engineers, rainforest gardeners. That's Patrick Freeman's kind of phraseology right there. Beautiful stuff. It's true that they have an important role in both in the rainforest for the forest elephants and on the savanna. And Stanford's own Dr. Rodolfo Dirzo has been working in Kenya showing the connection between the role of large mammals in keeping down rodent populations, which are significant vectors of human disease. Very interesting work. And probably, I don't know what's the most important, but certainly new factor in play is the breakdown in the clarity and enforcement of the ivory and rhino horn ban, commerce ban. Why has that happened? Well, over time, first of all, there were some loopholes in the 1989 ban. It didn't cover pre-imports and exports, pre-ban exports and imports. So you had some grandfathering. Then you had so-called one-off sales of national stocks of ivory that CITES now in retrospect should never have approved, but they did when President Mugabe in 1999 asked to sell some of Zimbabwe's national stockpile to Japan as an experiment. The theory being, hey, let's put some more ivory in the market. Maybe the price will come down. And then in 2008, very coincident with the huge spike, you had another so-called one-off sale of ivory to China and Japan from Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe again. The theory, again, this would satiate demand and potentially reduce prices. In fact, it seems to have fueled demand and probably more importantly, provided cover, if you will, for the illegal ivory that is mostly at use. Now, the plan was for this legal ivory to be carefully tracked, and it wasn't. Ivory disappeared, and so is a failure. Okay, so that's the depressing part of the talk. Now for the good stuff. This just I use this to show the fact that one of the reasons why I think the ivory ban in 1989 sort of diminished over time, you can find ivory in stores, and they will say that Many stores will say it's legal because it's over 100 years old. Antique ivory is exempt. I mean, unless there is messaging that ivory should not be traded, you're going to have a diminution of the effectiveness of an ivory ban, obviously. Okay, so what are the key ingredients to success to turn this around as we face what looks to be a very, and is in fact, a very difficult situation? What do we need? We need global leaders to bring focus and to commit resources to the effort, and we need to identify and implement an effective way forward. Well, we're doing pretty darn well on the first point, and I think we have a game plan for the second point. In terms of key global leaders bringing focus and resources, Secretary Clinton, as I mentioned, in November of 2012, gave a major address before she left the State Department that generated the start of this attention. She continues it with Chelsea, Stanford graduate, Chelsea Clinton, through the Clinton Global Initiative. Last November, they pulled together 17 major NGOs and a number of African leaders, collected $80 million, and have an ongoing effort to convene folks to help deal with the scourge of wildlife trafficking. It's something that they deeply, personally, and emotionally are tied in with. Then you had, very importantly, actually, before we get to our president, let me mention CITES. So the CITES convention is held every 2 or 3 years, and the last meeting of the parties was in Bangkok, Thailand, in March of 2013. And at that meeting, CITES is starting, the CITES Directorate, led in part by the U.S. delegation, which is led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, part of the Interior Department. Don't be fooled. At that meeting, the CITES convention put essentially a watch on 8 countries that it concluded are illegally involved in African trade of either ivory or rhino horn. They include Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, China, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And this summer, the Standing Committee of CITES was going to decide, those countries were asked to come with a plan of action to stop the illegal trade. Those plans are in. The CITES Standing Committee is going to make a decision this summer whether they're adequate or whether they want to bring sanctions against those countries. Hold that thought. President Obama, with President Kikwete of Tanzania, this is July 1 of last year, announcing the executive order that he issued to stop poaching. It's called, it's Executive Order 13648 on combating wildlife trafficking. Let me read 3 quick sentences to you from the policy statement. The president says, the poaching of protected species and illegal trade in wildlife and their derivative parts and products represent an international crisis that continues to escalate. Poaching operations have expanded beyond small-scale opportunistic actions to coordinated slaughter commissioned by armed and organized criminal syndicates. The survival of protected wildlife, species such as elephants, rhinos, great apes, tigers, sharks, tuna, and turtles has beneficial economic, social, and environmental impacts that are important to all nations. Wildlife trafficking reduces those benefits while generating billions of dollars in illicit revenues each year, contributing to the illegal economy, fueling instability, and undermining security. Also, the prevention of trafficking live animals helps us control the spread of emerging and infectious diseases. For these reasons, it's in the national interest of the United States to combat wildlife trafficking. The president then appointed a cabinet-level task force co-chaired by Secretary of State John Kerry, who, as senator, had held hearings on the subject, co-chaired by Secretary of the Interior Sally Jewell, and co-chaired by Attorney General Eric Holder, charged with coming up with a national strategy to how to deal with this within 6 months, and also establishing an advisory council on wildlife trafficking. What happened next in terms of leadership? The United States, the Fish and Wildlife Service, did a crush of the U.S. stock of ivory last November. That was followed by France, Chad, China, and Hong Kong, all destroying their national stocks, telling the world that ivory should have no value. We want to take it out of commerce. Although somebody could say this is a very valuable national asset, no, we need to destroy it. We had the Botswana Elephant Summit followed a month later, hosted by the president of Botswana, 30 countries, 27 non-governmental organizations coming out with 14 strong measures. And then we had the national strategy that came out in February of this year. And then we had the Brits. We had Prince William, who also is passionate about this, and Prime Minister Cameron hosted a world conference in February. And we have hope from China as well. Let me give you a couple of quick points there. On March 3rd of this year, Yao Ming, the Chinese basketball player who played with the Rockets and is a true hero in China, working with Wild Aid, who's former chairman of the board, is in front of me here, delivered a petition to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference asking China's government to ban the sale of ivory. Along with the petition, 36 of China's top business leaders signed a pledge to never purchase or give ivory as a gift. And then just a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese premier Li Keqiang announced a $100 million donation to combat poaching in Africa as he was visiting Africa. Bottom line, there's good leadership emerging, strong leadership emerging in the international sphere, including from Africa itself. So, the other key ingredient, identifying and implementing an effective way forward. We have the national strategy document. It came out February 11th of this year. It talks about 3 strategic priorities and a whole gaggle of focal areas. The strategic priorities, as you can see, enforcement, both domestic, U.S. being, and global, reduce demand for illegally traded wildlife, strengthen international arrangements that protect wildlife. This is a very long and difficult, it's not difficult, it's just a long and complicated document. It produced a 69-page set of recommendations from the Stanford Law School's Policy Lab on wildlife trafficking from this spring. Many of the students are here today. So we're not going to read the 69 pages of recommendations. I know you're disappointed. Instead, we're going to focus on Hayes's top 5 action items under the national strategy. We'll go through each of these in a bit of detail. So first is, not surprisingly, goes to the question of commercial trade. Second, recruiting U.S. businesses and global businesses to join the fight. Third goes to African capacity. Fourth goes striking hard at transnational organized crime and terrorist connections. And fifth, pouring a big effort in resources into reducing demand. So, first one, no commercial trade. Now, I think you've heard from me quite a bit about this already, and I think it's apparent why we need to get back to where we thought we were in 1989, which is a clear statement that we are taking ivory and rhino horn out of commerce. Commercial trade. Why do we do it? It worked before. Number two, because of the size of the market, almost infinite, it seems, the insatiable and inelastic demand and the shortage of animals, that's the only way forward. And even a hard-bitten economist has to agree to that ultimately. And we also have a track record. We tried putting legal ivory into the system with those one-off sales. They failed miserably. As Ian Hamilton Douglas of Save the Elephants, who was here on campus a couple of weeks ago, said, any present call for reopening a well-regulated legal trade is utopian and unrealistic. Corruption, mismanagement, weak penalties for wildlife crime, and a lack of political will to change things mean that too often poachers have the upper hand. And finally, we have a ban on the books. We have an international trade agreement that has elephants in the most protected status, and therefore we have an additional vehicle for enforcement that has been underutilized. Get to that in a minute. I will say this causes some pain. And in fact, the president, when he announced the national strategy on February 11th, also announced a tightening of the ban by taking a number of administrative steps that have created a lot of concern, and that I'm happy to talk about offline. But it has to be done. Number two of 5, recruit U.S. and global businesses to join the fight. So the national strategy, I'm thankfully, you'll be thanking me that I'm only quoting a little bit from the national strategy. It says, we must team more effectively with the transportation industry, the tourism sector, restaurant and hotel associations, companies that operating internet marketplaces, and other private sector entities in this effort, and that is right. Remember the blood diamond crisis within the last 10 years? The question of, are you buying diamonds that are providing financing for violent groups and essentially human torture? What happened? The industry came together with the governments, set up a process, so-called Kimberley process, requires a certification that these diamonds are not financing conflict. It's industry working with governments, in that case, to make a legal industry not be undermined by illegal behavior. Some of those same principles apply here, obviously different. We're trying to take ivory and rhino horn off the market. What a good way to do it and with a twofer if our businesses that are involved in, for example, transportation between Africa and Asia or Africa and the United States do voluntary codes of conduct saying we're going to take the following steps and make sure that no ivory is in our holds. How about if the high-end retailers, the Tiffany's of the world, who already has approved the ban and issued a press release on February 11th commending the president for the ban, if they identify what they're doing to make sure that they are not selling illegal ivory, and the auction houses, et cetera. In fact, right down the street at eBay, eBay was one of the first companies, obviously they have an internet marketplace, to on its own ban ivory being sold on their marketplace. If we get the US companies and global companies to do this, we can make a huge difference. Number 3, build Africa capacity. So this is where the sort of natural instinct is, okay, the poaching is occurring in Africa and the poachers are outgunned. So let's get them equipment, let's get them training, let's get them organization so they can stop the killing there. Yes, we have to do that, but it is a problem because of the rampant corruption. And the assist with organization piece is critical. There needs to be a plan that a willing African country has, and it needs to deal with the corruption issues. There is no silver bullet in terms of drones, in terms of high-tech equipment and helicopters if there's corruption in the system. But where the countries are willing to take it on as they are now appearing inch toward, yes, we need to help with that. And in fact, our U.S. military should help. Right now, the U.S. military in AFRICOM is only supposed to provide training to military personnel in Africa. Ironically, the front lines of the real war going on are park police. They're not military. We need to change that and get the resources of the military to help. Fourth, right attention on corruption. We need to talk about it. We need to confront it. I mentioned the successful effort in Tanzania in 1989, the UHI effort that really stopped poaching coal. Last fall, there was a similar, seemingly similar effort that went badly wrong in Tanzania. Innocent folks were killed, livestock were killed. There was a huge backlash of the population against this anti-poaching effort. 4 cabinet ministers were fired, including the very well-respected Minister of Tourism and Natural Resources, who was trying to clean up Tanzania. His predecessor had been caught with his hands in the cookie jar. And the parliamentary chairman who led the investigation into what happened believes that there was corruption behind this, and this was an effort to show a failure. And it's set back the anti-poaching effort in Tanzania. On a brighter note, coordinating with U.S. embassies, we have a new ambassador to Tanzania, Mark Childress, who just took up residence last week. He was the president's deputy chief of staff. You probably never heard of him, but he was very close to the president. He is very committed to this issue. And the only other politically appointed ambassador in sub-Saharan Africa is Patrick Gaspard in South Africa, who was the head of the Democratic National Committee during the last election and very close to the president. So you have two of the hot spots in Africa manned by U.S. ambassadors that are committed to implement the president's plan and will not be stopped. And they know where the corruption is. They know how to deal with it. We have a tremendous opportunity there. And finally, I think we need better information, in Africa-based information about what's going on. And here we have some terrific philanthropists who have entered the picture. Paul Allen and his organization, Vulcan, is committing many millions of dollars to do an African census of elephants. We have lousy census information. Some governments are not cooperating. There's a sense that they should own the data about what's happening with their wildlife. We need to move beyond that and encourage a Pan-African investment in well-respected information about what's happening, good and bad, that can chronicle what we hope will be the return of the elephants. And so perhaps at an African university like the University of Cape Town, that could be a center for information that's well-respected, peer-reviewed, scientific, et cetera. So lots of good things to do in Africa. Then we need to strike hard, number 4, only one more after this, at the transnational organized crime and terrorist connections. Now, we're sort of fortunate in a way, unfortunate in another. Interestingly, the president in 2011 issued a strategy document to combat transnational organized crime. And in this document, the president noted that really today's international security arrangements and the international integrity of our trading and economic systems are being undermined not so much by nation states, but by transnational organized crime. And the summary of this report gives a flavor of that. It's a transnational organized crime, TOC, threatens U.S. interests by taking advantage of failed states or contested spaces, forging alliances with corrupt foreign government officials and some foreign intelligence services, sound familiar? Destabilizing political, financial, and security institutions in fragile states, undermining competition in world strategic markets, creating the potential for the transfer of weapons of mass destruction to terrorists, expanding the narco trafficking and human and weapons smuggling networks. Terrorists and insurgents increasingly are turning to criminal networks to generate funding and acquire logistical support. TOC also threatens the interconnected trading, transportation, and transactional systems that move people and commerce throughout the global economy and across the borders. 3 types of transnational organized crime were mentioned in this document: human trafficking, arms trafficking, and drugs. Not a word about wildlife trafficking. That was fixed in February. It was actually fixed in last July with the executive order where the president said, put wildlife trafficking into this initiative, which is robust and essential, particularly, I think, in Africa for obvious reasons. So there are tools that are being developed under the strategy. They include tools to track illicit assets associated with the traffickers, with the corrupt officials. There's an interagency threat mitigation working group identifying the networks, getting the intelligence community to focus on them. There's a transnational organized crime rewards program that Secretary Kerry, the day before the crush in Denver last year, put out $1 million reward for tips leading to the disruption of a Laos-based criminal enterprise that, quote, facilitates the killing of endangered elephants, rhinos, and other species. So these ideas are being adopted. Sanctions to block property, to deny entry to transnational criminals and corrupt officials sound familiar. These are tools we can and now should extend to wildlife trafficking. And finally, and this gives a sense of the type of mapping and intelligence capability that comes with the labeling and the categorization of this as a transnational criminal enterprise that deserves U.S. attention. So finally, we need to pour resources into reducing demand. And this is not where your mind first goes on this issue. Again, there's so much interest in stopping the killing at the source for obvious reasons. But if we do not get a handle on demand, particularly in Asia, we will not win, period. And the national strategy document recognizes that reality, noting that criminals will continue to kill wildlife and traffic in contraband as long as the potential profits remain so high. In fact, the national strategy says increasing anti-poaching and anti-trafficking enforcement efforts will only have limited effect unless we work simultaneously to address the persistent market demand that drives this trade. Demand reduction should get as much attention as the efforts inside Africa itself. How to do it? Clear messaging to change consumer behavior. I'm going to show a couple of clips real quickly. Businesses' code of conduct. Remember what I said before about businesses helping reinforce the notion that they're not going to be involved in ivory trafficking. It is not acceptable business behavior. And forceful use of public diplomacy and international sanctions. So first, the use of public diplomacy and international sanctions, and then I'll show a couple clips and we're done. In terms of the international sanctions and public diplomacy, first of all, John Kerry, who feels very strongly about this as our Secretary of State, put this on the table as part, last July, of the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue. And that's key. The U.S. has to go full out with China as its partner and say, you've got to help make this stop. Also, I think the U.S. has to use the tools it has in the international arena to bring pressure on governments that are not complying with their obligations under CITES. And as I mentioned before, CITES now has a pathway to do that. And every time there have been serious concerns raised about compliance with countries and their CITES obligations, those countries have backed down. Russia for caviar, the UAE for falcon trade, Fiji and Vietnam for not doing sufficient national wildlife trade legislation, Guinea right now for violating export on great apes. There is a mechanism. The U.S. has to go into those summer meetings this summer and really push hard. There's also something called the Pelley Amendment, which gives the Secretary of Interior and Commerce the right to ask the President to issue trade sanctions against any country that is violating their international wildlife obligations. The President just took action on a request by Secretary Jewell against Iceland for illegal whaling and rebuked Iceland for their practices. That's also an opportunity. And in fact, there's a pending a request to go after Vietnam for its illegal rhino horn trade. And finally, in the last category here, there are important trade agreements. Interestingly, the Bush administration worked very hard to deal with illegal logging issues internationally, and they injected in the U.S.-Peru trade promotion agreement, a number of requirements that Peru undertake and commit to do to reduce illegal logging. Right now, the United States is negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, an important opportunity. So let me give an example or two. And I don't know how this is going to work. I'm going to go right to the video. And how do I do the video? These are very short commercials that are primarily sponsored by Wild Aid and also by Save the Elephants. They're being showed worldwide. The Chinese are allowing these commercials or some like them on Chinese TV, which is also a wonderful sign that there's a thaw there on this issue. And let's roll. 3 short videos.
You don't have to play ball to be a great shot blocker. Never buy illegal wildlife products, and we can save our endangered animals.
When the buying stops, the killing can too.
As a father, I want our children to know that rhinos are not just a picture in a book.
As a father, I want our children to be able to swim with sharks, not just eat them in a soup.
作为一名父亲，我希望我的孩子有机会在野外看到大象。
For future generations, let's not trade these animals into extinction.
Please ask your friends and relatives to never buy rhino horn, ivory, or shark fin.
没有买卖，
就没有杀害。
Great.
"24 seconds. That's what you get to make it happen. You can run the break, find the big man inside, or swing it out and hit the 3. Grab the board, and you get a new 24, just like that. But unfortunately, for endangered animals, there's no reset. Many are now facing extinction, and when their clock runs out, they're gone forever. So please, support conservation, and never buy products made from these animals. There's no more time to waste."
So that's a reminder that we need some advertising in the U.S. as well to increase our awareness of this. So let me close with just go back to the heart part as well as the head part. I'm going to close with a quote from Pope Francis in a sermon that he gave March 19th of last year, around the same time that one of those horrible incidents I mentioned was occurring. He wasn't talking about elephants or rhinos, but he could have been. So here's what he said. "Please, I would like to ask all those who have positions of responsibility in economic, political, and social life, and all men and women of goodwill, let us be protectors of creation, protectors of God's plan inscribed in nature, protectors of one another and of the environment. Let us not allow omens of destruction and death to accompany the advance of this world." Thank you. I can do a few questions. Please don't hesitate to. Oh, there's a microphone that, because we're taping, if you don't mind just coming to the microphone. Yes.
So it seems to me like the reduction of demand has got to be, of the top 5, one of perhaps the top of the top 5, and Asia seems to be the epicenter. So are there other ways that we could reduce demand, maybe promote substitution products? I know it's a little controversial to talk about boar's tusks, say, as a substitution product, or some other way of reducing demand. I'd love those advertising bets, and I wonder if they could incorporate strategies like that.
I think it's a good question, and I think the substitution is certainly possible, and certainly for ivory, where there are carvings and there are other medium to potentially. So we have our advisory council has a meeting coming up on June 9th, just a week from Monday in Washington, and we're going to be asking the administration to put together some meetings to get experts involved, really, to help make decisions both about what is effective advertising. Obviously, we've got a great head start with Wild Aid and Save the Elephants, but also on issues like that. So certainly, and that was mentioned in the Stanford paper, in fact. Yes.
Thanks so much for your talk. This is a really important issue. One thing comes to my mind talking about an information hub in Africa. Are you familiar with Ushahidi? It's Swahili for testimony or witness, and it's a crowdsourcing via smartphone that was organized to report on election fraud in Kenya. And I just can't help but think the corruption's so pervasive.
Yeah.
If every African had a smartphone, and if you took that $1 million that John Kerry had and broke it into smaller chunks, and every report of loading something on a boat or somewhere if that led to a conviction, that person got a reward. But somehow having all those eyes on the ground seems to me the only effect. Shooting that Ugandan helicopter shooting a video of it hovering over where the massacre occurred. But somehow we need all those eyes on the ground. And Ushahidi was founded by Kenyans who I think went to Harvard Law School and went back to Kenya. So they should be involved.
Thank you. We'll certainly look into that. And as you know, as part of that, what hasn't happened yet, it's not clear sort of where the information should go. That important information. In some of these countries, it's pretty well known who's doing these things, but you know, a lot of folks think there's got to be an outside international enforcement effort to be able to follow through because of the corruption issues. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Hi. Good evening. I appreciate the opportunity to see this very tragic evening. I have been fortunate enough to go to Tanzania twice and went to Sulu in 2008, and we were told then that the poaching is really ruining the families of elephants and their behavior, and that what happens is elephants that only have one tusk are not killed, but then they create an abnormal family cohesiveness because the animal that doesn't have two tusks will pervade on the other ones to part of their nutrition is scraping the nutrients off bark. So if the leader doesn't have her two tusks, then her whole personality changes and it changes the whole herd.
Right.
Is there any assessment of how, even if you can stop it tomorrow, all the trade and all the illegality, what's going to happen with the recovery of the herds?
Well, that's a good question. I know Patrick Freeman knows something about this, and I was going to mention it, but in the interest of time, I didn't. There is great concern about impact on social structure from poaching because obviously the primary targets are often the older animals that have the experience and train the younger animals, et cetera. So it can be extraordinarily tragic. And I guess the good news, if you will, is that after the '89 ban in a number of countries, there was quite a rebound pretty quickly of elephant populations. So I'm sure something is lost in that, but we're not at the point where we don't think that if we stop the scourge that the elephants can't come back in a healthy way. Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you. I had sort of heard of, maybe it's just for rhinos, given what she said about elephants using their tusks, but maybe darting the rhino, removing the tusk, and so perhaps rhinos can do okay with that. But I was just wondering, is that a valid strategy, like to go across removing the horns from rhinos? And I guess maybe, again, if you could confirm that's not possible for elephants. Just wondering about that.
It is, rhino horn can be removed without injuring the elephant, at least, I'm not sure about psychologically, but physically, it's much more difficult to do that for elephants. If you're removing the tusk, you're likely killing the elephant. There are a few exceptions to that. That it is a complication because in South Africa, a large proportion of the rhinos that are left, not a large proportion, a significant proportion, are in private ranches, and there's interest in South Africa in trading rhino horn to generate income for the owner, and it's serious. It's very serious view that they may ask that the classification of rhinos be downgraded so that they can trade rhino horn, which I didn't go into here, but would be a horrible mistake. And I can't imagine, frankly, the CITES parties would allow that to happen. Sorry,
I meant for, and then destroy the horn so that poachers wouldn't.
Well, yeah, what I've heard about that is that the poachers don't always know that the rhino doesn't have the horn, and they may be coming up late at night and killing it, or they may be mad that they went and tracked this rhino and all of a sudden doesn't have a horn, they'll kill it anyway. That's what I've heard about that. Sorry for the confusion. I think we probably have to cut it off, or can we do one more quick one? Okay, very good.
Hi, so my question is about reducing the demand for the horns.
Yes.
So I heard about like the public displays where they destroy a lot of these horns happening in some Asian countries also. So I was wondering if it's ever been tried that instead of destroying the horns that are confiscated, if it would be possible to try to sell those and find out who the buyers are, and then criminalize the buyers so that you are like trying to reduce the demand rather than destroying the horns. Has that ever been tried?
I think you have a future in law enforcement. But yeah, yes, to some extent. I mean, the U.S. has this operation going on right now for rhino horn, where they do sting operations, basically, which is kind of the same thing, right? Introduce the rhino horn and try to track it. So there definitely are, but obviously it's got to be a controlled environment and with professionals. But I think that is one of the techniques that needs to happen. It obviously is important to get to the kingpins and not, at the point of poaching. The folks who are actually doing the killing are getting a pittance, and it's the ringleaders and the syndicates that are making the money. So, thank you. Good question.
Thank you.
Final word, or
just a quick one. That was an unbelievable talk. I'm the Wild Aid rep here, and I'm not going to talk about us at all, except to say that the Chinese have been unbelievably helpful on this. They've given $200 million a year to show these ads, and the Chinese people have been really responsive. The demand for shark fin soup is down 70% in the last 3 years, which is probably going to save many of those species. Most of the things that we work on, which are endangered species, are primarily consumed in Asia. Rhino horn is primarily consumed in Asia. The one thing that we're all talking about here and that we work on that isn't just consumed in Asia is ivory. And there's a big market here in the U.S. So to the extent, as David was saying, that you hear about efforts to reduce ivory consumption in the U.S., and it's pernicious because anything which is partially legal, the bad guys win because they game the system. So I believe over the next few years there's going to be efforts to stop it coming up at auction. The eBay thing was early, and of course it's Silicon Valley. eBay was ahead of the game. But if you want to make a difference, that's an area where there may be things coming down the road that you could really make a difference here.
Thank you very much.